All right, so what is a metaphor? A metaphor from the Greek is to mean to transfer over or to carry over. So metaphors, that's exactly what they do. They transfer the meaning, the value, maybe certain attributes, certain characteristics over from one object onto another object. And that's why they're so effective in design because they're used to transfer ideas over, concepts over, and different ways of actually understanding both the metaphor itself and the end product. So, just a little bit of history on the word metaphor itself. Originally, it came from the Greek, developed into the Latin to the word metaphora, and then eventually, the French adapted the word that we say today, which is metaphor, sort of in the 16th century. And so that's kind of a brief history on that. But the important thing I want you to grasp from this is the idea of carrying over, transferring over attributes, essences, roles, functions, and form from one object onto the other idea or object. So here's a few examples, that we have obviously heard before. I kind of like the BTAD is like drinking out of a fire hose because that certainly is the case. So one of the metaphorical bases for this class is this idea of biomimicry. And so when you look at nature and you use nature to help you create design solutions, then relying on this use of metaphor from a biological standpoint is a very effective way of creating innovation. One of the ways that in which you can do this is sort of following this pattern that you see here on on this sort of spiral of biomimicry. So usually what you do is you start off by discovering, searching for natural models in nature. Maybe you're dealing with water, so you look at different organisms, different plants, different animals that deal with water, whether they purify water, whether they store water, whatever it might be that's relating to your need or your problem. You would start by researching that. Then you would move to the abstract phase where you're actually taking different things from those organisms. You're identifying their form, their function, their specific role in nature, and different essences about those different organisms, and finding ways in which you can then transfer that over into this brainstorming and potential applications. This phase allows you to then figure out how could you potentially transfer over the way nature does things onto the way your design would like to do things. And then moving on to emulate nature strategy, figuring out how you then incorporate those ideas into your design, and then evaluating to see whether or not that was an effective sort of biomimic relationship that you developed. So here's a few biomimicry examples. If you look at the beak of the kingfisher and you look at the front of this high-speed train in Japan, you can see that they highly resemble each other. That wasn't an accident. The designers that developed this high-speed train were dealing with a problem. Every time a train would pass through a tunnel, it would create this sonic boom because of the air that was being compressed. So what the designers did was they looked into nature and they found ways in which different organisms were able to penetrate the air or water, and as a result, they found the kingfisher. Well, the kingfisher is a, by the title of its name, is a fisher bird that actually dives into the water to capture fish. Well, they realized that how it enters the water is extremely clean without very little splash, and so they eventually adapted the actual the form and the role and the essence of many attributes from the kingfisher and applied them to the front of these trains. And as a result, they were able to eliminate these sonic booms that these trains were having to experience. So the metaphor comes something along the lines of this: if a train were a bird, it would be a kingfisher. And so If you were to change that and say if a train were a bird, it would be a pelican, well, that wouldn't work too well, because if you've ever seen a pelican dive after fish, it creates much more than a small little splash. So that's why it's important to be efficient and careful with what you select as your metaphor. Here's another product here, an ice axe. So the metaphor here is ice axe as a woodpecker. The actual designers of this product literally studied woodpeckers to see how they adhered to the wood and the trees, the shape of their neck, the shape of their beak, the angles, different things of that nature, and they literally created a superior ice axe for mountaineers to utilize out in the field. Once again, starting with nature, starting with a metaphor, starting with a source for inspiration, and then carrying over and transferring those attributes over to their design. So, what purpose do metaphors serve in the development of a design concept? Well, we've kind of talked about that a little bit, but let's go further. A metaphor is a device for seeing something in terms of something else. Once again, it's that transferring, carrying over, and it's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. It brings out the thisness of that and the thatness of this. It's kind of a play on words, but Kenneth Burke, 1945, kind of had an interesting way of looking at it. And then once again, a metaphor is a lens by which a concept is seen. You change the metaphor and you change the concept. So, although it's up for debate whether or not the metaphor came first or the metaphor was later applied to the Volkswagen Beetle, but simply it still works. So, whether it was an accident or whether it was intentional, that's up for debate. But if you were to think about the Volkswagen Beetle, it does attribute a lot of those characteristics, and it does carry over a lot of these ideas of a beetle onto a car. So if you had maybe changed the metaphor slightly and said, okay, instead of saying car as a beetle, let's say you said car as a boxfish. Well, this is what you would have. You would have the Mercedes boxfish car that was developed, that looks very much like a boxfish. Now, why did they do that? Well, because they realized that the boxfish, of all the fish in the ocean, has the least amount of drag. And so what they created was they created an almost zero drag vehicle. Mercedes did, by actually looking at the attributes, looking at the form, the essence, the roles, and the function of the boxfish, and they metaphorically transferred those ideas over to this vehicle. Now, it's not the prettiest thing. It's certainly, in this case, form is a result of forces, not necessarily just man's whimsical movement of the sketch pen, but the result of the form was due to the fact of the forces that were studied. So metaphors, once again, are about juxtaposition, not about comparing one thing to another. It's about transferring information over. So, and one thing that I've always found is that innovation is almost always the byproduct of juxtaposition. It's a way of seeing two different things in contrast, or I'm sorry, not in contrast, but in an overlay, kind of a transparency. If you were to take two different objects and put them both on 50% transparency, then you would begin to see that juxtaposition. So let's talk a little bit about roles, essence, form, and function. So form and function are things that you are probably very familiar with. They are concepts that are taught to designers from almost day one. What's interesting is that form, like the spoon up above, is really only externally descriptive, and it's not a catalyst, but it's actually the result. It's really form, just in its basic form, to use the play on words, is just the actual shape. It's the contours. It's the external attributes of an object. The form, as a result of being a result, comes from roles and essences, which we're going to discuss later, and it does in some ways also stem from function. So form is a very easy thing to understand. Function, once again, something else very easy to understand. It's the object's execution. It's what it does and how it works. So some people might say the role, okay, and we're kind of getting and jumping ahead to the role, but the role of a spoon I'm sorry, the function of a spoon is to feed. Well, that's actually not the function. That's the role of a spoon. The role of a spoon is to feed human beings or feed whatever you want to feed, I guess, if that's a specific role that you're talking about. The function of a spoon is actually to hold content. So if you see this image right here on the bottom right, the pure function of a spoon is to just merely hold objects within its sort of concave shape. That's the pure function. And so if you were to actually take a spoon and put some sugar into it and set it on the table, it would still be functioning as a spoon. Okay? But if you actually fed somebody the contents that were on a spoon, then you would actually be enacting the role of the device. Okay, so a role of something is the assigned task for a product, and you can ask yourself, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, for example, if you take a look at these two different images here, you've got the role of one spoon to be utilized as a feeding device for an infant, whereas the role of the spoon in the upper image is to be used as a digging utensil or a digging tool. So same object, same form, same function, because in both cases it's potentially holding things, but different roles. One role of the spoon is to dig in this case, and one role of the spoon is to feed. Now, you can debate whether or not that was the assigned task specifically thought of prior to designing it, but as you can see, the roles can be changeable. They can change, and they're irrelevant based on the actual shape or function of the spoon. If you guys remind me, I've got a kind of a funny story with regards to roles and essences and form and function about spoons in particular. So if I don't remember, be sure to remind me in class, and I'll tell you a funny little story about spoons in general, and something that happened. And then looking at the essences, the essence of something is the unchangeable qualities. It's what something is, and essences tend to be catalysts for design. So what are the essences of the spoon? Well, it's made out of metal. It's generally lightweight, or maybe it's not made out of metal. Maybe it's made out of metal with the actual spoon portion of it being soft and pliable and is made out of rubber or silicone. So things such as soft, hard, light, heavy, metallic, durable, those are all essences of objects. Color can also be the essence of an object, as long as it's not something that can potentially change, or if it maybe does change, like thermochromic ink or glow in the dark objects, then that is still the unchangeable quality of those things. So remember, roles and essence, very different from form and function, but have a very specific purpose within the process of design and concept development. Okay, so here's a few other sample metaphors to kind of just wrap up this idea of concept development. Here you have this idea of water bottle as a cactus. So what would a water bottle look like? What might how might we develop a water bottle, to sort of use the how might we phrase? How might we develop a water bottle that functions as a cactus? How might a water tower function as a billboard? That's another way of looking at it. And then how might a house actually move like an elephant? So anyway, I hope this presentation was helpful, and I hope to discuss this further in class. Feel free to email me with any questions that you might have, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion in class. Take care. See you guys later.